Good evening, everyone. We are ready to begin our webinar for this evening. My name is Helen Taguri. I'm the Manager of Patient Programs at Crohn's and Colitis Canada, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to moderate today's webinar and to learn more from our guest speakers, Dr. Sarah Ahola-Kohut and Jack Kerr. I'd like to start by welcoming everyone to the first webinar in the Youth Education Series, and then I'll outline today's agenda. I'll just take a few moments so that we can let a few more people join us, and then we'll begin the webinar for this evening. Okay, to begin, today's education webinar, Below the Surface, Mental Health and IBD, is hosted by Crohn's and Colitis Canada and is made possible through a grant from AbbVie. Please note that a link to the recording of tonight's webinar will be emailed to you for future viewing. We'll also add this video to our YouTube channel. You can find this video recording and all of our other video recordings of webinars on our YouTube channel at Get Gutsy. For those of you who are new to webinars, I'll quickly run through the logistics and how you can ask questions. Right now, all of the participants are automatically muted so that everyone can hear the presentation and we can capture the webinar recording without audio interference. If you would like to ask questions at any point during this webinar, you can type it into the chat box. Simply look to the right side of your screen and you should see a questions field. Throughout the webinar, enter your questions there and we will make note of it and try to get to as many questions as we can for the Q&A portion at the end. If you experience technical difficulties at any time during this webinar, you can also type into the chat box and we will follow up with you directly. If you are having trouble hearing the speakers, it may be your computer's audio setting. Try calling in with the phone number provided using a mobile or landline phone. Great! We're ready to get started. Before we begin with our guest speakers for this evening's presentation, I'd like to provide a little bit of background on Crohn's and Colitis Canada. Crohn's and Colitis Canada was established in 1974 by a group of concerned parents of children with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. We are a national charity with more than 65,000 supporters and 80 volunteer groups and chapters across the country. Our mission is to find treatments and cures for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and to improve the lives of children and adults infected by these diseases. We want the general public to be aware of these chronic diseases and the toll it takes on nearly 250,000 Canadians living with Crohn's and colitis. Crohn's and Colitis Canada has funded over $88 million in research to date. That makes us one of the largest funders of Crohn's and colitis research in the world. Today's webinar is the first in our youth education series and is part of our patient education programs. Other programs that Crohn's and Colitis Canada provides includes the Gutsy Peer Support Program, an online peer-to-peer program for individuals living with Crohn's and colitis and their caregivers. We also have the Go Here Bathroom Washroom Access Program and the AbbVie IBD Scholarship Program. Additionally, we provide educational brochures and we host local educational events that cover a variety of medical, social, and psychological topics related to Crohn's and colitis. If you would like more information, please visit our website at www.crohnsandcolitis.ca. Thank you. And now to introduce our two speakers, I'm actually going to allow the speakers to introduce themselves. So Sarah and Jack, please go ahead.
Okay. I'll just try to see if I have the power to change the slides here. as we figure this out, I'll introduce myself. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Sarah Holokohut, and I am a psychologist, and I work with the IBD Center at Sick Kids. And once I can get over to the slides, I'll give a bit more detail. Okay, I think we're going. So as I said, I'm trained as a psychologist and has trained sort of classically with primary mental health at various institutions in Ontario. But from about 2011, I've really dedicated my time to working with kids and teens and their families when they live with some type of a physical illness. I also have the luxury of doing not only clinical work, but research as well. And really my program of research looks at therapies and programs to support the quality of life of children who do live with chronic health conditions. And at this point, that's really encompassed a lot of work on peer mentoring, as well as mindfulness and acceptance-based group therapies. I'm gonna let Jack introduce himself and then talk a little bit more about what I do sort of day to day now.
Hey everybody, my name's Jack Kerr. I'm a fourth year undergrad student at Queen's University in Kingston. So I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis 3 years ago, or closer to 4 now, when I was in grade 12. So since then, I've sort of tried to be active in the Crohn's and colitis community as much as possible. I've had a role in chairing and being a part of the Queen's University Crohn's and Colitis Committee. We've sort of raised funds and worked closely with the Kingston chapter of Crohn's and Colitis Canada, running events and various fundraisers like Gutsy Walk and educational events. And in the summer, one of the biggest things I've done is I've been a camp counselor for Camp Guts and Glory, which is like an IBD specific camp in Nova Scotia. And sort of I've been a big advocate for mental health and sort of taking care of yourself and doing everything you can and like using all available resources. And sort of throughout this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about my experiences and sort of what I've learned and what I think are like good steps and good tips for others to sort of deal with like coping strategies and mentoring, navigating stressful day-to-day life situations.
So as I said, sort of what do I actually do is on a day-to-day basis as a psychologist who works at the IBD Center, which is a kind of a unique position because I can say that 99% of the patients I see actually have IBD. So I've gotten a kind of a good inside look about what it is like, and not that I will ever actually fully get it. I think it's a unique position, and the reason I say that is because I think the best part of my job is that once a critical mass of patients complain to me about something, I have the power through my research world to actually develop programs to deal with those issues in a way that I feel can be quite practical and realistic, and that's my hope. And I really do, with every part of my job, just try to make your lives easier. It's also a little bit of a plug for the Medical Psychiatry Alliance, which I am part of, and really what the Medical Psychiatry Alliance does is it's trying over the course of several years to really improve access to mental health supports. I say in my slides in Ontario, but I think we're using that as a bit of a springboard to be able to provide better access across Canada. So why have this webinar at all, and why talk about mental health? I think it's not just because I'm a psychologist and I'm completely biased and I think emotional well-being is important. I think even looking here that quality of life overall is really about more than physical health. And what we'll talk about here in more detail is, yes, the physical health piece, but also psychological state and social relationships, because there really are many different factors that make up quality of life. The other piece of it is that you're not just managing IBD, but life in general, especially young people who are going through a lot of change, whether it's graduating from high school or college or university, work, relationship, becoming more independent. And I think change is hard. I think thinking about change is even harder. So mental health can have a real impact on all those things and how to balance it all. Now, I have a real passion about mental health in young people in particular because I truly believe that if you can learn the skills to take care of yourself and take care of yourself well when you're young, you can really prevent future secondary problems. So, for example, sadness or depression that's related to social isolation.
Yeah, I think right now mental health is a really strong topic, and a lot of people are making a push for it to sort of get more awareness and break the stigma with companies like Bell, with their Bell Let's Talk campaign. And there's a lot of information out there right now, and I think it's important to go through and sort of sift through almost a bit and talk about what's like relatable to IBD, what we think will work, and just sort of give you almost like a starting point, because mental health is obviously like a huge field.
Absolutely. So mental health and IBD in particular. So when people want to know about rates, and the research is really mixed on mental health issues, and there's lots of reasons for that. So, I mean, research will tell you anxiety can be seen in upwards of 40% of people living with IBD, depression upwards of 20 to 30. But there's certain things to consider with why there's no sort of hard and fast number that we can give in terms of people living with IBD and mental health issues. And I think first and foremost, the rates of depression and anxiety in adolescence is already quite high. So usually people will say about 20% of the general population has some type of mental health condition. Also with IBD in particular, the timing is quite important, because when it comes to research and rates, like, are they asking when someone's in the middle of a flare? Is it a time where there's a certain amount of stability in symptoms? And oftentimes with research, the samples tend to be sort of, mostly doing okay. And I mean, that has to do with the fact that if someone's going to ask you to do research, if you're having a really tough time, you don't want to do any of those extra questionnaires they ask you, or those extra needles, extra whatever. And I think that's fair. But I do think that it's safe to say that living with IBD, your risk or your rates of anxiety, depression, and stress are higher, not only when compared to the general population, but also when you compare it to people with other types of chronic conditions. And I think that is the case for several reasons. I think living with any lifelong disease, it's a big deal. Many young people want to blend in, they don't want to stand out, and bowel movements are just not a regular topic of conversation. It's uncomfortable for most people. And I would argue that especially for teens or young adults, people don't want to talk about what happens in the bathroom. So it can make it that much harder to find the supports that certain other chronic illnesses may have in place. Diseases of the GI system in particular are also more intimately linked with mental health for several reasons that we'll go throughout the webinar. But just to give you one example, sometimes they call the human gut the second brain. And the reason they do that is that gut bacteria actually creates hundreds and hundreds of different neurochemicals that the brain then uses not only for physiological processes, but also mental processes. So again, for another example, 90 to 95% of serotonin, which is a neurochemical, is manufactured by the gut bacteria. And serotonin is a very important neurochemical involved in depression. So when you think about it, there is a bit more of a complex relationship whenever you're talking about the brain, mental health, and any diseases of the GI system. Now, how does mental health actually impact IBD sort of in a day-to-day? And I think it is very complicated, and it works both ways. Poor physical health, being in a bad flare, that can be definitely hard on your mental health, but also poor mental health can lead to physical issues. Physical pain can be a component of depression, it can be a component of anxiety. the other piece of it that makes it that much more complicated is that symptoms of mental and physical illnesses can often be quite similar. So in IBD, for example, often people will have bouts of fatigue, but fatigue is also a core symptom of depression. Or if we want to use the example of diarrhea, so diarrhea is often a complaint of people who have IBD, but it's also associated with anxiety. And people with chronic or acute anxiety can also have loose stools. And the issue is that it's not quite clear. And sometimes it can be a little bit more straightforward, but often it can be quite complicated in terms of which is exacerbating the other. Is it because of the IBD? Is it because of, say, an underlying anxiety disorder? Those are things that aren't always easy to figure out. But what the research will show, it maps on quite well, is that IBD symptoms and flares are absolutely related to disease activity. But IBD symptoms can also be brought on or exacerbated by anxiety, depression, challenging life events, and even how one copes. Now, this is not to say that this happens in all people by any means, because it doesn't. It's just that for some people, there is a connection that is a little bit more clear-cut. There are, in my practice, I've seen people who are living with IBD who have enormous amounts of stress in their life, and it does not impact their IBD at all. The symptoms do not get better or worse. Then I have other people who I see who quite regularly, they know that when they're in a period of time where there's going to be a lot of stress, that quite likely there will be an exacerbation of IBD symptoms.
Yeah, I think just sort of building off what Sarah was saying there, it was to a certain extent they feed into each other. I know from personal experience that it's very, very difficult to sort of separate when you're having some mental health issues and from your minor, mild IBD issues. And I think that sort of that uncertainty and they can feed into each other. So it's often tough to have healthy IBD and be in remission if you don't have proper mental health. And sort of the same way too, if you have rough go with your IBD and or maybe in a flare-up, it's also tough to have mental health. So I think they do feed into each other a little bit there.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as Jack was saying, that mental health issues can ebb and flow with IBD, but they can also be a little bit more stable. So one can come before the other, sometimes they come together. But really, I think you can all say that stress, depression, anxiety, at the very least, will make everything about living with IBD more challenging. So whether that's taking care of your physical health, exercising, seeing friends, I mean, if you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, it's going to be that much harder to get up and do the things that you want to be doing. Or if you're in a place where you really just don't want to be reminded of your IBD, it's going to be that much harder to take medications every day or vitamins or do the things that you need to do to keep yourself healthy.
Yeah, it's a lot of that is theoretical and talked about, and it translates directly into real life. It's impossible to stay healthy if you sort of overcommit and overschedule yourself to the point where you're exhausted, frustrated. So it's important to, you can't maintain a healthy body and attitude if you're drained and at the end of your line. You know your body, you know your limitations. Other people don't know that. It sounds simple, but sometimes the best option is just simply saying no. Saying no can honestly just relieve anxiety. It gets rid of unneeded stress. I'll touch on it in a bit, but surrounding yourself with the right people, they'll understand if you have to say no. It also comes down a little bit to being proactive. Sometimes the best you can do is just preparing yourself for a worst case scenario. It's not some think that that might be thinking negatively, but if you just think to yourself, okay, what's the worst that could happen? then you can almost like relieve yourself. So carry maybe an extra pair of underwear and shorts in a backpack with you, for example. Download various like different bathroom apps on your phone, planning a route so you know where like bathrooms are along the way. And just like being honest with others about your disease are all things that will help like ease anxiety and like minimize your stress. So also like recognizing times in your life where you might be more stressful. It's a little bit easier said than done, but like maybe you have a big move coming up, or maybe you're planning on changing jobs. For like students in high school, university, maybe you've got like tests and exams. Those are times that are like typically associated with high stress, and by like recognizing that you might be more stressed in those times, it sort of allows you to prepare for it a little bit. And like it's the last point there, but like creating a support group is so important. It's something that I didn't, it's not that I didn't take it as seriously, but I didn't really think about it until I really needed one, and I didn't have a strong one. So it's something that I've like really advocated for and like done so myself, is that you need like people around you that understand. They won't know what you're going through, but like if you have to bail on plans last minute, or maybe you have to like end a conversation early and just like run to the washroom, it's just like people that you can lean on for support if things do go south, and that's very important.
Okay, so stress. Stress is something that I talk about a lot, and I think stress in IBD is extremely important. And I think I'll start by saying that our brains really are wired to survive. Not to say that our brains aren't trying to help us be happy, but I think the number one goal of our brains is to just make sure we survive, and stress is there to keep us alive. Now, the stress response itself is quite complex and involves lots of different areas of the brain, but really where stress impacts IBD in particular are in places, for example, like with inflammation or gut motility, or even a person's ability to take proper care of themselves. I'm not going to go into all the science behind how precisely stress impacts IBD, because to be quite honest, it could quite likely be its own entire webinar, but suffice to say that stress does matter. And it's not as easy as just, keep calm and don't stress, because stress is just an inherent part of life. If you'll notice, there are references along the bottom of a lot of these slides, and those are there so that if anybody wants a little bit more information, they can definitely get it there. And as I mentioned before, stress in particular can really trigger symptoms of IBD in some people, not all. And the research has shown that high long-term chronic stress in adults actually triples the risk of developing or exacerbating, their IBD symptoms. Research has also shown that when people are under stress, it makes it harder to tolerate pain. So again, stress really, at the very core of it, will make living with IBD more difficult, and in some people will make the symptoms harder to manage. But everyone gets stressed sometimes, and you can't avoid stress, especially when you are if you're an adolescent or a young adult, where there's a lot of transitions happening and there's a lot of change, and that's inherently stressful. But what your body does and what your body wants is it wants balance or homeostasis. And when it's stressed out, it is going to prioritize various bodily functions in order to obtain that balance again. So this is what they call the fight, flight, freeze response. So I'll talk a little bit about this because I think it also highlights why stress in particular is something that should be taken extra serious for people who have IBD. So when the body is stressed, whether this is acute stress or chronic stress, something has to take a back seat when your body's trying to prioritize either fighting, flighting, or freezing, whatever it is that's causing the stress. I'm going to use the example of a saber-toothed tiger because that happens to be the picture I found for this slide. So say a tiger is coming after you. Your brain will begin to pump blood to your body so that you're ready to fight the tiger or run away from the tiger. but at what cost? So what functions need to take a back seat? So I'll list 4. So one of them is your body's ability to rest. I mean, the last thing you want to be is relaxed when you've got this saber-toothed tiger running after you. Number 2 is your body's ability to digest food. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you can digest that hamburger you had for lunch when a saber-toothed tiger is about to eat you. 3 is your appetite. Again, you're not going to go and stop for a milkshake if this tiger is chasing you. You are going to do whatever you can to get away. And 4, your immune system. Because it doesn't quite matter to your body if you can fight off that cold really quickly when you're quite likely going to be imminently harmed by the saber-toothed tiger. So now you might notice that from those 4 examples I gave you, so being able, your body's ability to rest, your body's ability to digest food, your appetite, and your immune function, these functions are actually quite aligned with some common IBD symptoms. So in some ways, when you're living with IBD and you have a lot of stress, you can be doubly hit. Because now imagine that that tiger is a deadline, or is a transition coming up, or an exam, or a move. Stress on that level just becomes a little bit more complicated if you have IBD versus another chronic condition or to the general population. So I think in this sense, people kind of assume that, you know what, people are under stress. They say nowadays people more generally have higher levels of stress, but I just think that it's important to focus on taking care of yourself and getting to a place where, yes, you can acknowledge that there's going to be stressful events, but what can you do to be proactive?
Yeah, like we were just saying there, stressful situations will arise. Like in life, you're going to get stressed. And just acknowledging this and learning that this is going to happen instead of worrying about getting stressed. Because if you're just going to be stressed about getting stressed, that's just going to increase your stress levels. You have to plan to how you're going to minimize stress. Everybody is different. So trial and error. Just because something works for your friend or something works for your parents' aunt or something works for someone on the internet, that doesn't mean it's going to work for you. I think that it's super important to acknowledge that everyone's different and what works for you might not work for others and vice versa. A helpful little tip is keeping track of your symptoms in order to see what works and what doesn't. If you do have a deadline coming up or you do have a exam coming up, it can be helpful just to keep track of things. I know that during exam periods, I like to sort of keep track of what I'm eating and how much sleep I'm getting. So that's sort of taught me that I know my limits. I know that I need 8 hours of sleep a night. And I know that, and that's the most important thing. Other people will understand and respect that because I understand and respect that I need 8 hours of sleep a night. And by knowing your limits, that'll help prevent relapses. I can tell that sometimes I might be feeling tired or a little thing, and for me, sleep is a big thing. So for others, that might be a diet. Maybe you've been eating a little bit, you haven't had time to cook, you've been studying. Maybe you've let your diet go a little bit. Maybe you're not exercising. Everyone has sort of a different things that they use and different things that work for their body. It's important that you find out what those are and stick to it. And that sort of falls into the importance of being organized. So simple things like creating and sticking to a schedule, you build the sense of having a routine, and that can help during times of high stress. I like to use the example of school days just because that's what I'm going for. That's what I'm in. That's what I experience. But it works for work too. If you if you have a specific schedule, maybe your alarm goes off at 7:30 every day, and you go to bed at 10:30 every night, and then you eat breakfast every morning at 8 a.m., lunch at noon, and supper at 6. Just simple things like a routine. Just by sticking to that during times of high stress, I find can really, really help and reduce stress. For me, for example, I'm really big into staying active and using that as a bit of a stress relief. So I play squash twice a week during like a good week, and I like make sure that during a time like exams when it's really stressful, that I guarantee that I stick to this routine and I still play squash twice a week. I mentioned earlier, but you have to figure out what works for you. That works for me, and I can't promise that it's going to work for you. But like one of the worst things that I find in my experience is deviating from your routine. And it's okay to ask for help. You are not the same as your healthy friends or family or coworkers. If you need help, don't be embarrassed or ashamed to ask for it. It's a sign of strength that you can acknowledge that you need assistance, and most people will like respect and acknowledge that.
Absolutely. So what do you do when mental health issues come up? I wholeheartedly agree with Jack, and it's talk to somebody. I think the worst thing you do is not tell anybody and try to do everything on your own. There are lots of people who want to help, but they might not know how. So you can talk to your healthcare team. They're often quite good and able to direct you to various resources that might be a good fit, or your friends, your family, teachers, your bosses, because I think everyone suffers in some way, shape, or form in life. So I think there's times when everybody needs help and everybody needs to ask for help. So this is advice not just for people who have IBD, but just everyone. I think also acknowledging that living life to the fullest also means having a full array of experiences. And I think in some ways it can be more challenging if you're living with IBD, but the goal is still not to have zero stress or no unwanted sensations or emotions. And not to try to put a silver lining on something that's sort of can be quite awful, but pain, whether it's physical, emotional, psychological, or spiritual, can also help us appreciate the good. And thinking about what you can do to be self-aware and know what it is that you need to do. So one of the things that I often like to talk about is controlling the controllables. Having IBD means that on some level, there are certain things you just don't have control over. You cannot control every flare, you cannot control every IBD symptom, but that doesn't mean that you don't have control over anything. I think it's really important to focus on and highlight the things that you can control that can help you stay as healthy as possible, given your circumstances. So taking care of yourself, exercising, seeing friends, doing what's important to you, asking for help when you need it. Those are just some of the more basic things that you know that you always have control over. The way I see it is you have a control over how you respond to whatever it is that's going on for you in the moment, whether that's IBD related symptoms, whether that's a challenging social situation with friends or a relationship, or whether that's related to school stress. You do have control over how you choose to respond. And when it comes to the things that you don't have control over, just working on allowing that to be. So trying to strike a balance between ignoring symptoms and pretending that IBD is not there, and being completely hyper aware of every single GI symptom that you have. So I often like to use the analogy of unwanted IBD symptoms or negative emotions as being a beach ball. You can hold a beach ball underwater, but eventually it'll pop up. You can try to push it even further down, but when it comes up, it'll probably shoot up that much higher. And even if you could somehow hold that beach ball underwater forever, it would take a lot of effort and it would drain your energy. So why not kind of let that beach ball float beside you and direct your energy towards something that's really important to you? So instead of using your energy towards ignoring IBD symptoms or ignoring negative emotions, allowing them to be there, and then using that energy towards whatever it is that you would prefer to be directing the energy towards.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good tip of advice. Just because I've been there, I've been in bed and unable to get out of bed, and it's hard to accept that sort of feeling of despair when you're like, wow, why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? And that's like a tough skill to learn, is how to allow what you can't control be. You can't control the fact that you have Crohn's disease or colitis. You can't control that, but like Sarah said, you can control how you handle it. And I really like that beach ball example, because that's true. You could pretend and fight and pretend that you don't feel like sad, or you don't feel you want to ignore your IBD symptoms. But that's not like a productive use of your energy, and eventually that'll just come back to bite you. So I think that's a very, very important tip, is to like learn how to control, learn to allow what you can't control. And I think that's like one of the main takeaways you should take away from this.
And I think, you know what, it's easy to say, it's incredibly hard to do, but with practice, it is possible. It is possible. One of the things we wanted to talk about today as well is unpredictability. Because having IBD, unpredictability is inevitable. And no matter how much energy and amount of time you put into trying to avoid flares or thinking about what you could have done differently, having flares is just part of having a relapsing remitting disease like IBD. And I think that often people can be their own worst critics and think back and think to themselves, what could I have done to make this better? Or if only I had. But the thing is hindsight's 20/20, and when in reality, at the time, you likely made the best decision you could with the information you had. And again, having flares is part of having IBD. On the other end, I've also noticed that sometimes people get really worried about when that next flare is going to be, and being really much on the lookout for symptoms and what symptom might mean, okay, a flare is coming. So it's about trying to find that balance within the unpredictability of just being present focused whenever you can. So say you had a really bad flare and you were able to get over it, and suddenly you start having symptoms again. Try not to let that negative experience of the last flare color whatever's going to happen in this case. And try your best not to let uncertainty or unpredictability stop you from doing the things that are important to you. I think it's really important to use what's important to you and use your values as a guide in everyday life. And I say this whether you are someone living with IBD or not. So I think whenever you are trying to go about your everyday life, the path from A to B is rarely, if ever, direct. And what you can do is use values that can help you kind of get in the general direction and focus on living towards what's important to you. IBD does not have to be central to your entire life, although there will be times where it has to be. When you are, for example, say you're admitted and you're stuck in hospital, IBD is definitely central to your life in that moment, but it's not always going to be that way. So I find acknowledging IBD and the changes associated with the disease can really help you make decisions about your everyday life. And one of the important things is getting really clear about what's important to you. Maybe it's family, relationships, creativity. It could be something like wealth or adventure or achievement. And it sounds really easy when I say it, but it might not be, because it takes time to get to know who you are and what is truly important to you. But I encourage everyone listening to just take some time to reflect on what your values are. What will you choose to live for in the face of IBD or any other challenges that might come your way? So if I use myself as an example, learning is one of my core values. And that's one of the main reasons I found myself working in a profession that allows me to essentially go to school for the rest of my life. And I get to learn every day from the people that I work with. When your goals and your overall day-to-day life is aligned with your values, it can bring a certain peace that makes dealing with setbacks a little bit easier. It also makes your destination and your endpoint more meaningful, and it can be more deeply motivating, which can actually make a big difference if you're in the midst of a really tough time. Having that sort of goal or value that can act as a bit of a compass can just help make things a little bit more clear when you're in a really bad flare, for example.
Yeah, I think it's important as well to accept your IBD, and self-acceptance is definitely easier said than done. It can be tough to acknowledge that chances are you are going to have this disease for the rest of your life, and that's like a tough fact. I know for me that was one of the hardest things, but it starts with advocating for yourself. IBD, it's still a very unknown disease, both like amongst professionals and the public. So it's important to use resources to educate yourself, first and foremost, and then educate others about your condition. It's a lot easier for others to begin to understand what you're going through if they have a basic understanding of what the disease is. And that can be frustrating at times. I know I've done fundraisers and people will come up and be like, "Oh, what's Crohn's disease? I'm lactose intolerant. Is that the same thing?" And that can get frustrating after a while, but it's important to sort of stay above it. And by educating others, it sort of increases awareness for a disease like IBD. I think that what's important is exercise. So exercise can help a lot with like comorbidities associated with IBD, and it also releases endorphins. So like endorphins are little hormones in your body that make you feel better. And so studies have shown that individuals with IBD with higher levels of self-compassion generally have more positive coping skills and have reported lower levels of stress than people who scored lower on like a self-compassion scale. A tip that I was told when I was first diagnosed that I really like to give to others is treat yourself as if you're treating a best friend that was going through what you were going. So that's like tough to imagine, but just imagine your best friend was really sick, couldn't get out of bed, and was having issues. Like, how would you treat them? And that's how you should treat yourself. And everybody's different. That's a fact of life. Acknowledge that your needs may be different than your friends and family is a big step in like self-accepting that you have irritable bowel disease.
And also a plug for not forgetting your social health. Life is about relationships, and humans are social beings. We are not meant to be alone. And research coming out of adults who have chronic or recurrent pain, it's social disruption and not being able to see others. That's what actually predicts emotional well-being over and above whatever's happening to them physically. So staying social in your social life is just as important as your mental health and your physical health.
Yeah, don't let IBD stop you from doing the things you love. It can be tough. I know firsthand that when you're sick, the last thing you want to do is leave the house. Believe me. But it's important to be with people, like Sarah said. For me, I love sports and I love being active, and IBD took a huge toll on my ability to do things like play hockey or go golfing. By getting involved in like other aspects of the things you love. So for me, it was sort of coaching a little bit or providing advice to people that were playing the sports, things that weren't as physically demanding. And then once I was in a better state mentally and physically, I started playing again. It's about finding ways to continue doing the things you love in different capacities. You know what works for you. Listen to your body. And I can't reiterate it enough, just like being prepared. Little things like knowing where the bathrooms are, bringing your own food, maybe you eat before going out, bringing extra clothes. All those things can help you stay social while reducing anxiety about leaving the house. Best thing to do is surround yourself with supportive people. My friends understand that I may have to leave in the middle of a conversation or they might cancel last minute. They understand and support me when I do need them. And someone made a good point to me once, and it was like, think of one of your friends and think about their on a moment where they were really embarrassed. And chances are you cannot think of a moment that they were in a really, really embarrassing situation. So even if worst case scenario, you get stuck in a little bit of an embarrassing situation, chances are people will laugh and forget about it, especially if you handle it in a positive way.
That's a great point.
Yeah, so this sort of like ties into with finding a support group, joining an IBD community. And so that was one of the most helpful things I did, was when I became involved in an IBD community through Queen's University's Crohn's and Colitis Club. Just like meeting with and interacting with people who know what you're going through has been the most therapeutic thing. And it's helpful to talk and listen to other stories. And I've got to experience that being like a camp counselor too. These kids have come from small towns across Canada, and they'll come and they might be the only person in their town that has that. And just seeing their face light up when they say that they're on methotrexate or they're on prednisone and the other people know what that is, it's very rewarding. And you can see these sort of kids' transformation happen right in front of your eyes. And it's really, really important for kids, because oftentimes you want to keep it hidden from friends. Because like I know it was a struggle for me, was I was insistent that I was still normal, even though I wasn't. And so when you interact with other people of the IBD community, it allows you to be open and honest. And there's a variety of different ways to connect. But it's important, a little note about the online forums. You can't use that as like a replacement for doctor visits. I know, especially in the day and age of the internet, you can find pretty much everything online. But like a really important thing to maintaining like a good state of well-being is to trust that you're your healthcare professional. So you can't use the forums as like a substitute for a doctor visit, but use the forums or use the IBD community to figure out what questions to ask your doctor. Should I be on this drug? Should I try this diet? Maybe should I be on these supplemental nutrients? It's like really helpful to see and talk to what works for others. And then maybe you can ask your doctor if you should be trying some of those things. Because like I said earlier, everyone's different and things that work for some people might not work for you. So it's definitely important to use like the resources in the IBD community, but don't like change things without like consulting your doctor.
Okay. And a special note about privacy. I say this, and I say it very strongly, that everyone has the right to share as much or as little as they would like. However, people are naturally curious and will ask questions and sometimes say things that come out that might sound unkind, and it's not necessarily intentional. I think people are generally well-meaning. So something that I think is really important for anybody living with IBD is to come up with a short and sweet explanation that they feel comfortable with. For others, just to avoid any unintentional oversharing or feeling uncomfortable or getting into a situation where people are asking questions and you're not feeling really comfortable to give the answer, but you don't know how to back out of the conversation. I think having a memorized short explanation can often sort of curb that conversation from even getting started. And it is your choice. You don't have to tell anybody. I think it is generally helpful for people to be open and to talk about what they're dealing with. But again, it's completely individual. Now, in terms of actual therapies for, say, anxiety, depression, or stress, and you'll notice I focused on anxiety, depression, stress, and that's because by and large, a lot of the mental health issues that come along with living with IBD tend to be related to that. there's lots of different options and lots of different evidence-based therapies, whether it's individual or group therapy. There are workshops out there, or even online resources, but I think the most important piece is fit, so that whatever support you're getting, whether it's in the IBD community or through healthcare professionals, that a fit is good with whatever the therapist is, whatever the theoretical orientation is. And by that, I mean things like cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance commitment therapy, or mindfulness-based stress reduction. And I do want to take a minute to just talk about mindfulness, because it seems to be a pretty hot topic right now, and something that a lot of people are talking about, and there's may or may not be clarity on what mindfulness actually is. Ironically, the best definition I've ever found of mindfulness in terms of just being clear and straightforward is from mindful.org, and I don't generally condone just Google searches for mindfulness, or sorry, Google searches for definitions, but this one is from a reputable company or organization, I should say, and it's: mindfulness is the basic human ability to be fully present, aware of where we are and what we're doing, and not overly reactive or overwhelmed by what's going on around us. So the reason I want to talk about mindfulness is that what mindfulness does is it changes how the brain responds to stress. So the way that I talked earlier about how stress is actually quite important for people living with IBD, mindfulness tends to be a nice solution, or something that works for lots of people, not everybody. But what mindfulness does is it actually uncouples the primary sensation from what you think about that sensation. So to use an example to clarify, let's say someone's having abdominal pain. What mindfulness does is it separates the physical sensation of the abdominal pain in your brain from what you think about it. So pain is just pain. It's not the frustration with your inability to take the pain away, or it's not your thoughts of this is awful, this is unbearable, I can't take this. Pain, that abdominal pain, is just the physical sensation of abdominal pain. Now again, this sounds all well and good, but it's a lot harder to do, and something that takes a lot of practice, and mindfulness is a lot like a muscle and something that you have to develop over time. But what's really neat about it, and something that makes me quite interested in mindfulness, is that the literature, particularly in neuroscience, is pretty impressive. So I don't want to get too much into the science, but there's an area of the brain called the amygdala, and it's the region known to coordinate stress processing and physiological stress responses. So those things that I talked about when I talked about the fight, flight, and freeze. What they find is that the amygdala actually starts signaling less strongly following mindfulness meditation training. And in some cases, that training was only 3 days. What else is actually quite neat is that people who are dispositionally mindful, so these are people who are just naturally more mindful, or they're people who have been practicing mindfulness for a long time, so have brought mindfulness into a way of life. That type of dispositional mindfulness is related to decreased gray matter volume in the amygdala. So that's actually a structural difference in the brain just related to mindfulness. And that's why mindfulness in particular actually helps people react differently to stress, and in a way that may make stress just a little bit easier to handle, and may make some of those impacts of stress less strong for IBD symptoms.
Yeah, I think I know for myself, there's an app, it's called Headspace, and it's very introductory mindfulness. And I know mindfulness doesn't work for everyone, but it's a great introductory resource if you're looking for a place to start.
Absolutely. And looking ahead, just really quickly, because I know we're running a little short on time, is to say that there are a lot of people working towards better outcomes for people living with IBD. Obviously, Crohn's and Colitis Canada has been doing great work, and another group is it's called the Imagine Spore, which is a chronic disease network that's actually across Canada in 17 hospitals and universities, and their entire mission is to help transform management for people living with IBD, IBS, and the associated mental health issues that can arise from them. And they are actually looking at some of those sort of brain-gut interactions and what we can do to help make things easier. Also, I am very fortunate in that Crohn's and Colitis has funded one of my programs, the iPeer-to-Peer, with the goal of being able to provide live, face-to-face, peer-to-peer support for young people living with IBD. Knowing that access can be a problem, I just wanted to highlight a couple online resources about kids' health. There's mindfulnessforteens.com, and also loads of resources from Crohn's and Colitis Canada. One final sort of plug, we don't want to forget about parents. I'm not sure if there are any parents listening, but what I will say is that letting go is hard for many parents. It's hard for young people as well, especially when you're not feeling well, because most people, if they're not feeling well, will want to be around their families. And parents of children who do have IBD do experience lower quality of life because they're managing raising children and also having a child who's sick. But the research will tell us, and clinically I've seen it, that parents who take care of their own stress, it actually improves outcomes in their children. And I think siblings too are often not talked about, but also a very important person for people living with IBD. So we'll sort of end on this idea of perspective. I think that having perspective and good perspective on life and what really matters is a beautiful gift. That being said, I have never met anyone who has good perspective that didn't pay for it quite dearly. And there's a cost to clarity, but I think perspective does go a long way into finding meaning.
I think that's a great note, great line, Sarah.
Thank you. So I think we're good to open it up to questions if we have any questions. Sorry, we went a little bit late, but happy to answer.
Great, thank you so much, Jack, and thank you, Dr. Kohut, for your excellent presentation. You raised a lot of really good points, and I know our participants really appreciated your perspectives. I just want to remind anyone who is listening and has a question to go ahead and type your question in the chat box, and I'll be happy to direct it to our panelists. In the meantime, I did also want to do a plug for our Gutsy Peer Support Program. Dr. Ko had mentioned it in her presentation. It's an online peer-to-peer program. So we have 70 volunteers that have been trained as mentors, and they can provide anonymous support to anyone who signs up for a program. And that's for anyone who's over the age of 18. Or we also have mentors that can support caregivers. So if there's any parents listening, we do have this service available. I'm now going to open the floor to our questions. Before we start with the questions, I actually had one of our participants gave us a great quote. They said, "So far, you've survived 100% of your worst days. You are doing great." I thought that was a really nice quote to share.
That is wonderful.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that. The first question I have was related to something that you mentioned, Jack, but either of you are welcome to answer this question. They wanted to know, can exercise be a bad thing if you're still recovering from a flare? So, for example, if you're still on oral steroids, is it, I guess the question is it safe?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a conversation to have with your doctor. I mean, everyone is different. I know for me that I was coming off steroids as well. And a big thing with steroids, like physically, is that it can sort of negatively affect your bone density. And exercise is something that can sort of help build your bone density back up. So that's like from a physical perspective, but it's obviously something that like is how you're feeling. If you don't think that you're capable of going through an exercise, then you shouldn't be going through an exercise. And it's sort of something that I suggest like easing into, maybe starting off with like a quarter of what you usually do or half of what you usually do, and just sort of see how your body responds. but it's definitely a conversation to have with your doctor.
I agree. I think it's just definitely agree about talking to your doctor, but also just it's a practice in being self-aware and knowing your limits.
Great, thank you. So another question we have, and again, this is directed at either of you, is do you have any ideas or suggestions on how to respond to the question, how are you doing today, when you're actually not feeling very well, if you're struggling and you're just barely getting through, but obviously you don't want to divulge too much. Do you have any suggestions on how to answer that question?
Jack, do you want to go first or should I?
Yeah, I can go. I know personally, it's really something that I don't like to like dive into. I think it depends a bit on your relationship with the person asking. If it was like a family member or a really good friend asking, hey, how are you doing? I'd be like indulged to say, hey man, I'm not doing great today. It sort of like goes into, is that person a member of your support group? Because like if they are, that can be a chance to sort of lean on someone, to sort of talk it out. It can be super helpful. But it's obviously different for each person. If someone in passing or like a casual friend would ask me how I'm doing, I'd probably just like say, hey, I'm good, fine, how are you? Just because I'm not comfortable going into huge detail about my personal life with people I'm not that comfortable with. But that's like a self-reflection that I think everyone should have, is like how far, and Sarah touched on it earlier, is like having like a little spiel ready and prepared for if people ask you what Crohn's is or like how you're feeling, questions like that.
And sometimes sort of if you don't want to go out and say you're fine when you're not fine, is sometimes saying something as easy as, I've had better days, but I'm okay, or even just leaving it as, I've had better days. Most people, I think, will probably respond empathetically, but in everyday conversation, it doesn't necessarily always go beyond that initial back and forth.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have one last question, and then we'll probably have to end here. Someone's asking if you have any hints on how to cope with the loss of being reliable. So, for example, they said having to always be calling in sick, or being, the person who's not seen as being reliable anymore because of their chronic illness. Do you have any suggestions on how to manage that?
Yeah, that's like a really good question, and I can definitely relate with that. Because I remember the first summer after I got sick, I was calling in sick to work every second day. It felt like, and it's tough. And I think a big thing for me was being like as true to your word as you could. And so for me, it was like I would never commit fully. And like that can be a bad thing in itself. But if someone was asking me 2 weeks in advance to do something, I'd say, yeah, that sounds really fun, but you're going to have to ask me closer to the date. And that way that you're not fully committing yourself to stuff. And then when you do, and when you are able to commit to something fully, I think it's important to like commit yourself like fully to it. Like don't spread yourself too thin, or don't like haphazardly show up to an event or to your job. People will understand that you're sick and you're going through other things. And so I think it's just important to sort of have faith in yourself. And then sort of others will see that. And then when you do, I don't know, what I found worked for me was not committing as like readily to things. And just my favorite like cop-out answer is, yeah, I'd like to do that, but you're going to have to ask me closer to the date. And just making it clear right from the start that you do have an illness and that might come up and your attendance might be affected.
I agree wholeheartedly with everything Jack said. I think just knowing it's not your fault and being sort of upfront about the unpredictability, and that, you know what, I really do want to do this, but it might have to be a game time decision. And I think Jack also made a great point earlier about making sure you're not overcommitting. Mm-hmm. So to sort of, increase odds of being able to do whatever it is that you do commit to.
Great. Well, thank you both for your expertise today. This does end our question and answer session. we are running out of time. So I just want to thank you and also all of our participants for the great questions. As we're drawing near to the end, I just want to take this opportunity to let everyone know that we will be following up with you by email after this webinar, and we will be sending you a email asking for your feedback on future topics, and we will also be sending you a link to a recording of this webinar so that you can refer to it. If you missed anything, then you can have access to that recording, and at a later date it will also be posted on our YouTube channel. So this concludes today's webinar. Thank you so much for being with us today, and thanks for the great questions. I want to especially thank our speakers for putting in so much time and effort for us this evening. So thank you, Dr. Kohut and Jack, for taking your time out, your busy schedules. And also I want to thank our sponsors, AbbVie, for supporting this webinar and for investing in youth education. I also just want to quickly do a plug for another youth webinar that we have coming up on October 24th. The topic is Managing the Cost of Care, Budgeting with a Chronic Illness. Registration for this webinar is still available. For more information, you can go to crohnsandcolitis.ca, and you'll get a link to the webinar. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we've helped answer some of your questions regarding mental health and IBD. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good evening.